Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press. Today, we are off to Ghana, where we will be speaking with an old friend and a great thinker and organizer, Yao Graham. Yao is the coordinator of Third World Network Africa, a Pan African policy advocacy organization based in Accra, Ghana. Um, Yao has extensive knowledge and experience of Ghanaian, African, and international development issues from many years of work as an activist, intellectual journalist, as well as a government official. A warm welcome to you, Yao. Thank you for joining us on this show, organizing in the time of COVID-19. It's really nice to have you here.
Hi, Firas. Good to speak to you, and good to be get the chance to do this interview.
Great. Well, what I really like to get is a perspective from you on what is happening in relation to COVID. A perspective from Ghana. What is COVID helping us to see that otherwise we were perhaps not paying that much attention to?
I mean, Ghana is very celebrated uh, in kind of shall we say Africa watchers or those who are looking for a good African story. I mean, Ghana has been celebrated primarily because the country has had relatively free and fair elections with minimal violence, and we actually had regime transitions from ruling party to opposition, and so stable polity and steady economic growth over the years. Um, Although inside the country there have been raging debates about growing inequality and questions about the quality of government and so on. What I think COVID has done is in one with one knock, called sharply into view uh, fragilities which have been papered over by a certain kind of dominant narrative and presentation. What I mean, people have worried about, institutional capacities and stuff like that. But I think the COVID has helped to highlight that. But more importantly, also, I mean, the mood of people's expectations of what the state ought to do. Because if you listen every day, it's easy to assume that everybody has bought into everybody for himself, and that will take the hindmost kind of ideology. But in this period, you're getting a very strong sense of people expecting, that I mean the state and public policy has to be central to how society, responds to this challenge.
Can you perhaps help us to understand what is the essence of the government policies in relation to COVID?
Well, I mean, Ghana had the first case about 6 weeks ago. Currently, the more than 2,000 people have been infected or have been actually tested positive, because we really don't know what's going on out there. And the government's response has basically been one, to contain and minimize the spread. So public health measures around, the usual thing: people washing their hands, um, sanitation, and also social distancing, and a limit on gatherings. For a period, Accra and some other areas, major urban areas, were subjected to lockdown, but that was lifted a week ago. Um, but the rest of the country has not been subjected to lockdown. Alongside that, there have been some social measures also. During the lockdown, the government tried to offer support to people, particularly in poor neighborhoods. It declared that across the board, it was going to kind of provide water and absorb the cost of water for people in certain areas, and all for acting across the board, and also to absorb the cost of electricity for people in the lower consumption bands, but also kind of absorb the cost of 50% of the cost for other kind of consumers. And in terms of economic policy, some steps in terms of support have been announced for businesses. Banks have been asked to reduce their reserve holdings so as to be able to lend more freely. The government has dipped into the heritage fund from the country's oil export facility, which was meant to be, as it were, protected for at least 15 years after the passage of the law. But they amended the law and raided that reserve. Borrowed $1 billion from the IMF, and also basically rolled out, tried to expand the testing facilities around the country, and also some intensive contact tracing to try and identify those who have suffered. On the political side, sweeping emergency powers have invested, in the government, particularly the president, and all the police and military have been deployed as part of the regime for enforcing these measures.
So are you saying that the government has been using the pandemic as a way of militarizing the streets?
That probably would be stretching it, but to the extent that sweeping powers have been given to the government and the military have been added to the police to enforce, it means that some of the what we might call the normal restraints on state violence are lifted, because in emergencies, things happen, and these are justified in terms of emergency powers. There have been a number of incidents in some poor parts of Accra and in some towns outside, in other parts of other regions of the country, where the military have been and the police have been involved in breaking up gatherings. And also there was one incident in the market where somebody was shot. Organizations very quickly came out to denounce these incidents. Unfortunately, I think the president made a wrong call when he claimed that these things being pointed out were part of the fake news to discredit the military. And in fact, I think when one of the commanders of the military came out and said, the soldiers are trained not to misbehave, everybody thought that was a joke, because people's experience of the military in policing is that their first instinct is to be violent. But fortunately, this has not become a generalized pattern of behavior. And I think the public, quickly calling out the dangers of that must have contributed to, the relative kind of restraints that we are seeing, in that regard. But the powers have been vested, in the president, fairly sweeping powers, including, surveillance, access to people's records, and so on. And a lawyer in the law faculty of the University of Ghana has written, kind of a critical article analyzing the problems with the powers, considering that there was already an existing emergency legislation which contained, some checks and balances on powers, and has raised the question whether there was indeed the need for that particular piece of legislation to be added, because all that was needed to be done were adequately covered, by the old legislation. So these are some of the debates around the politics, and of course, there was an issue in Parliament about how the restraints on the use of the Heritage Fund was lifted, because some people claim that due process was not observed in how that was done. But these are just some of the indications of things that have happened. One of the things, of course, which has come into view also is that once you're getting the reserve fund like that raided, and there's additional borrowing from the IMF, it really puts on the agenda the questions of accountability, which has to be adequately provided for, and that I think it's a looming problem which would begin to attract a lot more attention in the coming period.
Yeah. Third World Network Africa has been amongst the institutions that has in the past been very focused on this whole problem of the debt. And here we have a country which already has a significant debt, a situation where on a global scale, the fall in the price of basic commodities, oil and so on, and in a situation in which now the government has taken this loan from the IMF. How far was that necessary, and what are the likely consequences of increasing the size of the debt?
I think for most African countries, including those who are indebted, it's a kind of catch-22 situation, really. I mean, there's a debate to be had about whether the debts that were raised in the past, whether those debts were necessary, questions about the terms on which the debt was raised, questions about the uses to which the monies borrowed were put, questions about the accountability mechanism to supervise how those things were done. I mean, on all those counts, I think the borrowing by Ghanaian government fall foul of those issues. But having said that, I mean, this is Ghana, like many African countries, is commodity dependent. You export commodities to be able to import. Commodities contribute substantially to public revenue. I mean, you have a moment of economic contraction where your normal revenue it's contracted. Commodity prices have collapsed. International trade is disrupted. Countries don't have huge reserves. We don't have the possibility of printing money like some other countries, which we can then use to deal with the need to import and so on. So I am of the view that in this period, countries need additional resources. Countries need additional resources across the board, not simply financial resources, but domestically, they need to be able to mobilize resources across the board. And they also need to mobilize financial resources, which is where the issue of the debt, external obligations, access to internal resources comes in. So if Ghana is borrowing from the World Bank, from the IMF, or any other entity towards presumably dealing with the burdens of COVID, I think the question we should be asking, what are the terms of the borrowing? What is the plan for using the money to deal with the pressures generated by COVID? Were other alternatives, better alternatives, considered before borrowing? What happened if those alternatives were considered and so on? I mean, I would ask the questions of any borrowing, domestic or international, in relation to the imperative generated by the COVID situation. That would be the same thing also that will come into view for those of us who are campaigning around debt relief or debt cancellation, that those monies should go towards the shortfalls that have occurred because of the economic consequences of the closing down of society, closing down of economies as a result of COVID. I say this also to connect it to, in a certain way, the need for us to avoid being stuck in a loop. Because 25 years ago, campaigners were able to get debt cancellation. We are back in the same place. And if we are honest with ourselves, we should be able to admit that something must have failed to allow the same patterns to be repeated, to bring us back to the point of another debt crisis. But connecting immediately to the challenges of what we expect states to do, states, governments, leadership, and responsibility of society to respond to the challenges of COVID must involve very broad-ranging resource mobilization, including being able to mobilize, to requisition, the assets of domestic private capital, big or small, and international capital within your jurisdiction. And also, in addition, to find support, whether it's by way of donations or PPEs, whether it's by way of finding the additional external resources to respond to the challenges which are posed. So the question for me really comes back to, where's the money coming from? What are the terms on which the money is being borrowed, and what use is being put to? In the Ghanaian case, there's still not enough transparency about the terms on which the loan is coming from the IMF. And this is something I've raised, in some other interviews, that resources are needed, but you cannot use COVID as a cover to borrow in the old way and claim that you're going to use it to deal with COVID, when in practice, it could very well end up, being misused, like happened with earlier borrowing.
One of the things that TWN Africa has been perhaps in the lead on the continent on has been around the intervention of transnational corporations into the mining and extractive industries. Is it not the case that these are companies that have very substantial concessions for the mining that they carry out? Is this not? Could not this have been an alternative source for determining Ghana's own future, rather than becoming more and more dependent on the IMF?
Well, I mean, actually I definitely don't want more dependence on the IMF. But in terms of this particular debt, its level in relation to Ghana's quota, and therefore the kind of conditionalities that the debt is likely to trigger, it's near the lower end of the spectrum. In relation to the mineral resources, if you look at what our countries definitely should be getting more from their mineral resources than they are getting at the moment. That's without question what should be the case. At the moment, gold prices have gone up to a 7-year high. But if you look at the terms under which Ghana is allowing the firms to exploit the gold, there are all kinds of problems. One, in fact, we've argued that a number of the agreements that Ghana government has at the moment with Anglo Gold Ashanti, with Goldfields, two of the biggest operators, those agreements violate the law because the fiscal terms are not consistent with the requirements of the statutes. All the big mining firms, in addition, are now using casual labor on a very big scale, which means that even their economic contribution to the domestic economy, they have managed to reduce that by giving, by using labor contractors instead of employing people directly. The industrial relations regimes that the mine workers unions have built up over, decades of struggle has been dismantled with government support by the big mining firm, because the government is committed to attracting, more investment into the mining, even as the actual net contribution in terms of revenue and overall economic activity is minimal. It's not optimized. Even that's before you come to the fact that the environmental impacts are not internalized when people are talking about their economic contribution. But in the near term, given the relations, that exist. Even if the Ghana government is unlikely, given its own orientation, given its practice, in a climate when many countries like Tanzania and so on and Zambia have been quite recently aggressive in trying to put pressure on the mining companies to contribute more. Ghana has been striking, in terms of the way the government has gone, in the reverse direction. So I think that's something that is worthy of note. But definitely, there could be a lot more in contribution from that. But the collapse of the oil thing also highlights the fragilities you see that come with commodity dependence, and short-term planning around commodity export values has proven once again to be a grave economic weakness.
Again, going back to some of TWN Africa's reports, I mean, you've done a lot of work on neoliberalism and finance, and uh, raised really important critical issues on that. Um, what kind of organizing has been done to try to bring about the change in this approach? Does this present crisis offer an opportunity to open up debates, to begin organizing, having popular voices expressed in terms of what the economic policies and social policies of the government should be?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in a certain sense, the crisis has largely validated demands that organizations like TWN have been making, for decades. Uh, but and also society is energized around those questions, in terms of people are concerned that governments respond properly and adequately to the challenges posed by the COVID pandemic, whether it's in the area of health, whether it's in the area of social policy, or whether it's in the area of economic policy, writ large. I mean, as far as finance is concerned, across the board, if you look at even the expressions from African indigenous capital, the squeeze that domestic firms, which are largely small and medium scale and micro enterprises, face in terms of their access to capital, to allow the development of indigenous entrepreneurs, the control that foreign banks have in our economies, the ways in which capital accounts have been liberalized. For example, when this crisis ensued, a lot of foreign investors who were holding about 25% of the Ghana's domestic debt were keen to dump their investments and leave, and therefore with consequences for the exchange rate and also the country's kind of foreign exchange reserves and so on. I mean, so there are lessons there. If you are going to have more control over your economy, there are some. I mean, one of the main areas must be the restraint you put on the freedom of finance capital, because we've been here before. Particularly, I mean, African countries have been seen as emerging markets, offering premium returns on investment and so on. Public investments increasingly are also subject to the activities of speculative capital through PPEs and so on. I mean, these things have infiltrated even the area of public goods, the creation of hospitals, public utilities, and so on. So these things have been highlighted in this period as really, if we are going to return to the provisioning of public goods, actually taming the spread, the spaces into which finance capital puts its tentacles, have been very acutely put on the agenda, even in areas where they may not be that visible, because the PPEs which are becoming important, including by foreign donors working with private capital from their countries, as a mechanism through which public infrastructure should be provided, has consequences for access to health services. A question which has been very starkly put forward in this period. So in our kind of perspective on this, excuse me, what we are saying is that the across the board responsibility of the state for managing and leading responses to the COVID, from the health to the economic. I mean, the resource mobilization imperatives which are called forth include also the taming, of the freedoms that finance capital has, in the national economy, and also in terms of the relationships that we forge, with the outside
world. So what kind of support is there for arguing against the kind of concessions that the government has made to finance capital, against the taking of further loans from the IMF? I mean, it is the rich who seem to benefit, and it's the rest of the population which suffers the consequences. Is there a rising anger? Is there a potential for organizing in the time of COVID?
In Ghana at the moment, I think there's a long-running public exasperation with corruption, and so anytime the government borrows, there's an interest. What are the terms? What is the money going to be used for? I think the public interest is really more not against borrowing as such, but about the terms on which the money is borrowed, and also the uses to which the money is put. Because on one hand, people recognize that, I mean, there's a lot of public investment to be undertaken. So if the government can raise money on good terms domestically or externally, in addition to what it raises from revenue, and apply it, it will be beneficial. But increasingly, of course, people question whether indeed this is what is happening. And I as in the coming period, I suspect that the interest in accountability for the money which has been raised from the IMF, I mean, the clamor is going to grow.
But is that only a debate about the terms of it, or whether or not Ghana should have put itself further in the clutches of the IMF?
Well, I mean, Firoz, quite frankly, I mean, if you consider, in my view, I think in this moment, African countries need to find additional resources. One of the arguments which has been made, for example, is that if the IMF created, let's say, new SDRs, which allowed people to borrow on basically, which will expand their quota and allow them to borrow with less conditionality, that will be good. I mean, I don't have anxiety about borrowing from the Bretton Woods institutions. I worry about the terms on which we borrow. I mean, why did India and China continue to borrow for as long as they did from, say, the IDA, for example, the idea of the World Bank? Because it was cheap credit, which they could use for infrastructure. And I think we should worry about the moment that our countries borrow, the terms on which they borrow, because really they are borrowing increasingly from the private market at high premium, the servicing of which can become a problem. So to focus on the institutional source of the money, which of course comes with some institutions, we know what conditionalities they bring. But there are a lot of cowboys also running around, for which our governments are borrowing, who are even less accountable, more opaque than the Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, I think the reasons why people call for the reform of the Bretton Woods institutions and the terms on which they lend to developing countries is so that there's some public finance increasingly available on terms which are better than countries will get from the cowboys, because this is a dilemma, that our countries face. And I think we should approach the thing in its totality, so that on one hand you are interested in the sources of the borrowing, you are interested in the terms on which the money is being borrowed, you are interested in the uses to which the money is being put, you are interested in the accountability, for the use of that money. Done that way, countries can borrow from a range of sources beneficially. Countries can borrow seemingly cheap credit without conditionality and misapply it. So I'm interested in the resource mobilization challenge that countries face and how these permutations play out in particular moments. That's why I'll be interested in this moment when, say, countries' earnings have collapsed and they need to raise money. On what terms are they borrowing from anybody?
One of the arguments made by, for example, Dongo Samba Sylla from Senegal, in a recent article which has only just appeared in French, but is, I gather, going to be available soon in English as well, is that he argues that so long as you borrow from in hard currency, in dollars, then the servicing of that loan has to be in the same currency.
But that puts, correct.
Which then makes the country even more dependent on export and production for export rather than production for need. So it becomes production for greed rather than production for need. So what's your response to that argument?
No, Ndongo is right. If you borrow in somebody else's currency, you have to pay in that currency. So the countries who are able, like the US, to print trillions and do domestic and support their domestic enterprises, one, they have the domestic capacity to produce. Okay. In addition, in the particular of the US and the euro and also the let's say the UK sterling, people also will take their monies as reserve currencies. So they have space. So you're absolutely right. If you borrow in hard currency, you have to pay. If you borrow in somebody else's currency, you have to pay in that currency. But the thing is this: if you look at where we are right now, there is a circular relationship between commodity export dependence and import of resources that countries consume. Do I want African countries to produce more of what they need among themselves and domestically? Because we're also talking here that it's not simply national level, but also regional markets and regional economies need to be better integrated, because most African economies are too small. But where we are sitting now in 2020, there's only so much domestic value that is available for the Ghana government to buy from Ghanaian producers in agriculture, in manufacturing, and in services. So that if we printed more cedis to buy, the things that are needed to deal with COVID, even as in some areas, you can initiate to deal with, processes to manufacture more, okay, to be more self-reliant. To be able to develop a manufacturing sector that allows you to meet substantially your needs. I wouldn't say all your needs, because we're not talking autarky. To reduce the import component of your economy. These are generational transformations. They are not transformations that take place overnight. So I think we need to discuss the medium long-term transformation issues alongside the near-term challenges. Okay? How many African countries have the capacity to produce the medical material, the equipment, and so on, which they need to operate in this period? How many African countries are producing the process inputs which go into so many aspects of economic life? So Ndongo's thing as a systemic analysis is correct. But on a day-to-day basis, living in an interdependent world, we will continue to buy things from outside. At the moment, it so happens that a substantial part of the consumption of most African countries is dependent on imports. And the process of transformation is exactly that. It's not going to happen in the 18 months that we are faced with the COVID crisis. Some of that can happen. Some of that it definitely will not happen.
But there is a contrast also. I mean, Cuba is exporting hundreds of doctors across the world to support. They've survived an embargo. They are unable to import, and yet this one of the most the poorest countries in the world, continues to have a spirit of internationalism and has managed to survive in these cases. So I think there's a lot more thinking we all need to do to learn from these.
Yeah, but Firaz, I will not compare Ghana and Cuba. Okay, Cuba had a revolution in 1959. Since 59, they have tried to build an alternative social, economic, and political model. The whole of society, 2 generations of Cubans have been brought up around the construction, the defense, and the advancement of that model, through good times, through bad times, and the social structure and the way public investments take place conform to that. So Cuba has more doctors. So that's where they are. That's where we are. Do I want us to get close to Cuba? Of course. There are many things about Cuba that I admire. But if we are going to talk about dealing with where we are, let's separate where we would like to go, what steps we need to take, okay, of which the Ndongo type argument definitely is part of it. Right. But even Cuba at one point, they had solidarity foreign exchange. They had the input of technology and things that they exported sugar to Comecon and got things. But they had an arrangement within a trading bloc which offered them special facilities. We all African countries are having to deal in the global economy as it is. Do we want to transform it? That is why people are engaged in struggle at so many levels. People work together internationally for reform of the international economic regimes. People work regionally for stronger Pan-African collaboration for change. People work domestically to mobilize the forces which can bring about change domestically, who can work with others regionally, and can also work with others, internationally. But as Cabral said, we must start from the reality of our land. We cannot imagine some other reality as the starting point for what we need to do.
Yeah, Nkrumahism and the losses that happened. One final message then from you to our audience. What would you like to convey?
I think this is a point I've made several times. I think the opportunity in this moment is the ways in which we press to restore a certain centrality of the role of a certain type of accountable state in the lives of people. And the accountable state issue goes, as I've said more than once, to also to the issue of debt and development financing, which you have raised, but also has been raised in terms of its capacity to respond to the needs of people. I mean, the Ghanaian case, the government announced this thing about providing everybody with water. So in some poor neighborhoods in Accra, people went to the private place where they normally buy water and said, the government says now everybody should have water for free. And the water seller said, oh, right, the government says water for free. This water here is my water. The government wants you to have water for free. It should provide it. Those questions are on the table. And for different sections of society, they manifest themselves, in a different way. The issues we've been discussing about an African country, the Ghana in the global economy, our governments have for too long gone along with the model. This discussion we're having underlines that they, in this moment, have to take on board, some of the changes that have been argued by institutions like ourselves. But at the end of the day, without a certain domestic mobilization to put pressure, not a whole lot of change is going to happen.
Indeed. I'm very grateful for you, Yao, for giving time for this discussion on organizing in the time of COVID. I would be remiss not to also acknowledge the sad loss that the Third World Network internationally has had in the passing away of Martin Core. Perhaps you'd like to say a few words on that?
Yeah, no, I remember so clearly the first time I met Martin. It was in the then Collett's bookshop, one of the progressive bookshops in London, I think in 1993 or 1992, when my friend and comrade Charles Abugre was trying to interest me in the creation of Third World Network Africa. So Martin was in London and we met and we spoke. Subsequently, I got involved in the creation of Third World Network Africa. And Martin was an amazing chap. Most people know him as this serious public intellectual, churning out, articles, ideas, working on so many themes from trade to climate change to health, you name it. But in addition to that, public intellectual, public activist, never sleeping person, Martin was a very funny, and engaging, person. So for me, I mean, the loss is not simply of a public figure, but of a close friend, somebody who I came to work with and really appreciated. And so it's a real loss. It's a real loss. He had been ill, with cancer since 2015. And sadly, he finally passed, but it's a real loss to us.
Well, Yao, thank you very much for appearing on this show and for your words of reflection on Ghana and the possibilities that are open in the coming period. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope we can return to some of these discussions at a later date.
Very much so. Very much so.
So great to see you again, and I look forward to talking with you again.
Thank you, Firas. Thank you, Firas. Yeah. Okay.
That was Yao Graham from Third World Network Africa. Thank you for joining us on this show, Organizing in the Time of COVID-19. This is Firoz Manji from Daraja Press signing off for today. And I hope we will be seeing you again in the coming period. Tomorrow is May Day, 1st of May, and there are many initiatives being taken up by the labor movement across the United States and indeed elsewhere. And I will be spending some of my time tomorrow helping to talk to people on the issue across the US. So just log into or find on the internet People Strike. This is the the slogan around which everything is being organized for tomorrow. So I hope we'll see you there. Look up People Strike online. This is Feroz Manji signing off for today.